She's just jobless now, living off her son." The words rang through the microphone, wrapped in a sugary laugh that sliced sharper than any blade. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. But then came the ripple nervous chuckles, polite smirks, the kind of laughter that fills the air when no one knows where to look. My cheeks burned, though I hadn't moved an inch. Danica, my new daughter-in-law, beamed, as if she had told the cleverest joke of the night. She tipped her glass toward the guests, her diamond catching the chandelier light. My son, Michael, sat at her side, eyes fixed on the tablecloth, the corners of his lips pressed tight. He didn't reach for my hand. He didn't say a word. Across the room, I caught sight of a man, Mr. Henley, the executive who had given Danica her big break. He sat stone still, his face hardening, as her laughter faded into the stunned silence of a room full of witnesses. I wondered if she noticed the shift in his eyes. I sipped from the glass of water in front of me, steadying my breath. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, the day my son found love, the day I watched him step into a future built on joy. Instead, the moment was carved into my memory as the night my dignity was dragged across a dance floor in front of strangers. No one looked at me directly. Some glanced quickly, pity flashing across their faces before they returned to their plates. I folded my napkin, slowly pressing it flat on my lap, my movements deliberate. If I spoke, my voice might crack. If I cried, they would say the joke landed too well. I sat still silent while Danica carried on toasting her own triumph. My son did not defend me, and that silence cut deeper than the insult itself. The night was only beginning, but I already knew it would not end in celebration. It would end in a reckoning. I wasn't always the woman people could dismiss with a single word like jobless. Once numbers and ledgers filled my days, the kind of work no one noticed until a mistake was made. I was an accountant for nearly 4 decades, steady as a metronome, keeping families and businesses from collapsing under their own chaos. When my husband died, suddenly, I was only 36. Michael was 9. Grief could have swallowed us whole, but there was no time for that. Bills don't wait for morning. I sold my wedding ring to keep Michael in college. I remember sliding it across the jeweler's counter, the metal cold and final in my hand. I skipped a month's rent once to buy him a computer he swore would carry him through his degree. The landlord threatened eviction, but I found a way to make it work. Every choice was a small wound, but each scar was a line in the story of how I raised him alone. Through the years, my reward was simple, watching him grow. Every A on a test, every trophy from a debate, every job application he mailed out, those were the dividends of my sacrifice. I told myself it would be worth it, that one day I would sit on a quiet porch with coffee in my hands, watching my son visit with his family, and know I had done enough. When I finally retired, I thought peace had arrived. No alarm clocks, no endless columns of numbers, no more long nights with aching eyes. Just mornings with sunlight cutting across the porch, steam rising from my mug, and the soft hum of a world that didn't demand more than I had left to give. But retirement did not protect me from being erased. Tonight in the hall, I helped pay for beneath chandeliers I covered the deposits, for I was reduced to nothing more than a punchline. All the sacrifices, the decades of grinding work, the years of silence, they vanished in the span of a careless laugh. And as the applause for their first dance began, I realized it was not the insult itself that hurt most, but who had chosen to stay silent beside her. Long before the wedding, the signs had already been there. I still remember the first dinner when Michael introduced me to Danica. They chose a sleek downtown restaurant, the kind with dim lighting and menus that read like novels. I arrived early, smoothed the wrinkles from my blouse, and told myself to be open, to give them a fair chance. Danica leaned across the table before the waiter had even taken our drink orders. "So, Mrs. Rowan Michael tells me you're between opportunities, semi-retired, but maybe still looking to do something for fun." Her smile was polished, but her eyes searched me like I was an entry on a balance sheet she'd already decided didn't add up. "Retired," I answered, simply folding the napkin across my lap. Danica tilted her head, lips curling into a smirk. When the menus came, Michael ordered the most expensive entree without glancing at the price. Danica followed with a flourish, asking for seared halibut, as if reciting a line she'd rehearsed. When the waiter turned to me, I asked for the seafood soup and a sandwich. It was what I wanted, simple, familiar. Danica laughed lightly, loud enough for Michael to hear. "Oh, we've all had budget nights, haven't we?" Her tone dripped with sweetness. But the barb landed. Michael shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. I sipped my water, pretending not to notice. Years of professional restraint had taught me to hold my expression still. I let the comment pass, but inside, I stored it. Every word, every glance, every laugh, that wasn't really a laugh. The rest of the evening played out with Danica, boasting about revenue figures, and Michael nodding at her every word. I sat there listening, smiling, when appropriate, already knowing something my son refused to see. Respect wasn't in their vocabulary, at least not for me. By the time dessert menus arrived, I wasn't hungry. I had learned everything I needed. And later, when the wedding day came, their performance didn't surprise me. It only confirmed what that first dinner had already revealed. It was just after the rehearsal dinner, when Clara found me standing alone near the back of the hall. She had been part of Michael's life since grade school, the kind of friend who never drifted far, even when years and distance tried to pull them apart. Now she wore the soft green dress of a bridesmaid, her hair pinned neatly, but her eyes carried a weight that had nothing to do with the wedding. Aunt Althea. She began softly, still calling me by the name she'd used since childhood. "Can I be honest?" I nodded, bracing myself. She hesitated, glancing toward Michael across the room, where he laughed too loudly at one of Danica's jokes. Danica stood close by her hand, gripping his arm like a leash, guiding him when to speak and when to stay quiet. "She doesn't respect you," Clara said finally, her voice almost breaking. "I've seen the way Danica talks about you when Michael's not around. And she doesn't treat Michael like her partner. She treats him like he's a pawn in whatever game she's playing." Her words struck deeper than she could have known. I wanted to defend him, to remind her that love can make people careless, but I had seen it too. The dismissive glances, the subtle corrections, the way Danica answered questions, meant for Michael as if she held the only authority. Still, I placed my hand gently on Clara's arm. Sometimes the truth has to reveal itself. If I speak too soon, he won't hear me. He has to see it with his own eyes. Clara frowned, clearly dissatisfied, but she didn't argue. She hugged me quickly before being called back by the other bridesmaids. I stayed where I was, watching my son, and wondering how many humiliations it would take before he finally noticed the difference between devotion and control. The music swelled as the night wound down, but the unease in my chest only grew. By morning, I knew silence would be my only weapon, and the wedding day would decide whether it was enough. Back at the wedding reception, the champagne was flowing and the microphone passed too freely into Danica's hands. She had already mocked me once, but the taste of attention seemed to embolden her. With Michael at her side and her friends gathered around, she raised her glass again. "Some people retire into wealth," she announced, smiling toward the front tables, "and others retire into nothing." The laugh she let out afterward was brittle, the kind that begged for applause. A few guests gave her the courtesy of polite chuckles, but most avoided looking at me. My son pressed his lips together, neither smiling nor stopping her. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Mr. Henley. He sat at the head table, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. But when Danica's voice rang out, his jaw tightened ever so slightly. I had seen that look before in boardrooms, when a superior silently noted that someone had crossed an invisible line. I lifted the cup of coffee in front of me, letting the warmth steady my hands. I didn't need to defend myself, not here, not in this moment. Words spoken in arrogance have a way of unraveling without help. Danica leaned in close to one of her bridesmaids, whispering loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear. I mean, really, what do you even do all day if you're not working? Must be nice. She tilted her head toward me as if the jab wasn't obvious enough. I met her gaze briefly, then lowered mine back to the dark surface of my coffee. Silence can be sharper than steel when used at the right moment. Mr. Henley adjusted his cufflinks, his eyes sweeping the room, pausing on me for the briefest second before turning back to Danica. He didn't smile. He didn't clap. He simply watched each second of her bravado digging her hole deeper. The music picked up, and waiters carried out the next course, but the air between us had already shifted. Danica believed she had scored another laugh. I knew instead that she had just lit the fuse. As I watched Danica laugh too loudly at her own cruel joke, my mind wandered back to a different time. A time when my name was spoken in quiet rooms with respect. Long before I retired, long before Michael's life consumed all of mine, I had been more than a mother stretching every dollar. I was there in the early days of Neurotech, when the company was little more than a handful of engineers and a mountain of unpaid bills. Investors were nervous, payroll was shaky, and one wrong calculation could have buried the entire venture. I sat at a scarred oak desk with ledgers spread wide, combing through every cent, making sense of the chaos. My job wasn't glamorous, but it was survival. Without my balancing, there would have been no product launches, no expansion, no story to tell. The founders would argue passionate, but reckless, and I was the one who steadied the ground beneath their feet. I kept the books clean, found the leaks in spending, convinced creditors to wait one more week. I learned to carry the weight of risk without showing the strain, because the future of every paycheck rested on quiet, careful hands. I never asked for recognition. When Michael was young and needed me home, I stepped away from long nights at the office. I chose anonymity because raising him mattered more than seeing my name printed in reports or industry magazines. The men in suits stood in the spotlight, shaking hands on stage while I stayed behind the curtain. That was fine by me. But I knew one thing for certain Mr. Henley remembered. He had been there in those boardrooms watching me stretch thin budgets into breathing room. He knew the truth behind the facade, even if Danica never would. Now, decades later, to be dismissed as nothing more than jobless felt almost laughable. I wasn't insulted for being ordinary. I was insulted for being underestimated. And as Danica went on flaunting her arrogance, I realized that recognition I had once turned away might finally rise again, this time on its own terms. The music softened as the newlyweds made their way from table to table, greeting guests like royalty on parade. I stayed seated, content to be overlooked, until Danica's hand tugged Michael toward Mr. Henley's table. My stomach tightened. I knew what was coming before she even opened her mouth. "Mr. Henley," she said brightly. Her voice pitched high with pride. "This is my mother-in-law. She doesn't work, just spends her days gardening and drinking coffee." Her laugh rang sharp and false. A few guests around the table chuckled politely, but their eyes darted toward me and then quickly away. Michael's face reddened. He shifted his weight, cleared his throat, but he still didn't speak. He looked down at his shoes, letting her words hang in the air like smoke no one wanted to breathe. I straightened in my chair, resting both hands on the table. I met Danica's gaze unflinching. If she thought I would shrink, she was wrong. My silence wasn't surrender. It was a mirror. I wanted her to see herself reflected in the ugliness she was so eager to show. Mr. Henley's fork paused halfway to his plate. He set it down slowly, his expression unreadable. His eyes flicked from Danica to me, then back again. He didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't offer the polite escape most would have given her. Instead, he leaned back slightly, as though weighing a decision. The room seemed to sense it too. Conversations dimmed around us. The air grew heavy, and the chandelier's light felt harsher, cutting across Danica's face as her grin faltered. She tried to fill the silence with more chatter, but the words stumbled. I lifted my coffee cup and took a measured sip, the clink of porcelain on the saucer louder than her fading laughter. I held my gaze steady, not at her, not at Michael, but at the space between us where the truth was already forming. The music swelled again, but nothing in that room felt light. Danica had crossed the final line, and though I had not spoken, the weight of her words had already set the stage for what came next. Mr. Henley pushed back his chair with deliberate calm, the scrape of wood against the floor slicing through the chatter around us. He rose slowly, his presence commanding more silence than the music ever could. His eyes were fixed on Danica, sharp and unblinking. "Hand me your access card," he said, his voice low, but edged with steel. The room froze. The laughter that had lingered moments before died instantly. Danica blinked, caught between confusion and fear. "It was just a joke," she stammered, her voice suddenly thin. Mr. Henley didn't flinch. "Respect is required," he said evenly, each word cutting through the still air. "You're done here." Gasps rippled across the tables, spreading like a current. A waiter stopped mid-step, clutching a tray of glasses that rattled with the sudden hush. Danica's face drained of color, her painted smile collapsing into something desperate. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but nothing came out. Her hand trembled as she reached for her champagne. The glass slipped from her fingers, crashing onto the marble floor. Bubbles and shards sprayed outward, the sound echoing louder than the band. The guests recoiled, whispers surging like a tide. Michael stood frozen, his jaw, tight eyes darting between his bride and her boss. He looked as if he wanted to step in, but his feet refused to move. His silence weighed heavier now than it ever had. I stayed seated, my cup of coffee steady in my hand. I didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't utter a word. This wasn't my victory to claim. It was hers to lose. Danica's breath came quick and shallow, her eyes darting wildly as if searching for an escape. Mr. Henley didn't move, waiting his authority unshaken. The verdict had been delivered, and there was no undoing it. The music faltered to a stop. Even the chandeliers seemed to hum with the weight of the moment, and as the fragments of glass glittered on the floor, I knew the night had shifted into something no one would ever forget. Danica sank into her chair, her shoulders shaking as tears streaked down the makeup she had so carefully applied that morning. The proud smile that once stretched across her face was gone, replaced by the broken expression of someone who had built everything on fragile glass only to watch it shatter. Michael bent down beside her, fumbling for words, his hand resting on her back. "It's okay," he muttered, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. He tried to console her, to shield her from the weight of her own undoing, but his eyes flicked toward me, and in them I saw something more painful than anger. I saw shame, not at her words, but at his silence. Clara appeared at my side, her bridesmaid's bouquet trembling slightly in her hand. She leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't say a word," she said, her eyes wide with quiet awe. "And yet you won." I didn't answer. I only lifted my cup, the rich bitterness of coffee grounding me in the storm of murmurs and stares. My dignity was intact, not because I had fought for it, but because I had refused to let it be taken. Around us, the reception had lost its shine. Guests whispered in clusters, some stealing glances at Danica, others at me. The band played on, but the music felt hollow, as if even the instruments knew the celebration had soured. Mr. Henley returned to his seat, composed his message, already sealed in the memory of everyone present. Michael finally stood, his face pale, his hand still gripping Danica's arm as though afraid she might collapse completely. But he did not look at her the way a husband should. His gaze kept drifting back to me, searching for forgiveness I wasn't ready to offer. I set my cup down the porcelain, tapping lightly against the saucer. In that moment, the choice was clear. I didn't need to raise my voice, because silence had already spoken louder than anything else. And as the weight of the night settled over the room, I knew only one thing remained to be done. The room still buzzed with uneasy whispers as I rose from my chair. My coffee sat half-finished on the table, steam fading into the heavy air. Danica's sobs filled the silence between the music, sharp and ragged, drawing sympathetic glances from some and cold judgment from others. Michael stood beside her, stiff and pale, unable to lift his eyes to mine. He looked smaller than he ever had before, as if the weight of the night had hollowed him out. I gathered my shawl around my shoulders, smoothing the fabric with steady hands. Each movement felt deliberate, final. I didn't need to raise my voice or demand an apology. The evening had already handed me what I came for without me asking. As I stepped toward the exit, I passed by their table. Danica looked up at me, her eyes swollen and desperate mascara streaked across her cheeks. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but I didn't give her the chance. I paused just long enough for my words to cut through the noise. Next time, I said softly, evenly, mock someone who doesn't hold the bill you just paid. Her face crumpled further, the meaning settling heavy on her shoulders. Michael's head dropped lower. His silence now, an admission of all the things he hadn't done to protect me. I walked on, not rushing, not looking back. The chandeliers glimmered above me, their light catching in the corners of the hall like fading stars. The doors opened, and the night air slipped across my face, cool and refreshing, after the stifling heat of the reception. I stepped outside, breathing deeply, letting the weight slide from me at last. Peace didn't come from victory or from revenge. It came from knowing I had never needed to prove my worth to people too blind to see it. And as the night stretched open before me, I knew I would carry that quiet strength with me long after their laughter and their cruelty were forgotten.